My name is Knut Nesse. You have probably but this time I wanted to make something special for you, a topic that I have not talked about before. I've called it the promising land, and it's about the immigration, Norwegian immigration to North America, which is quite interesting for us, especially here sitting in Canada. Many Norwegians came to Canada too, even though most of them came to the United States. And this is kind of a project that I've started, and this kind of a talk will always build on itself as we explore new things, as we hear new comments from you guys in the audience. So I'll be continuing to build on this as I give it several times, hopefully in the future, maybe also on Viking at some point in time. The reason it's very important for Norway to debate or to bring up this history is that as many as maybe 900,000 people left Norway. And Norway is a small country. Today we have 5.5 million people. Back then we were perhaps something like 3 million. And just imagine that maybe 900,000 people leave the country over a period of time. That's a lot of people gone. And there's kind of two stories here. There is the story of, back in Norway, all the people who left, why did they leave? What was left behind? What happened in Norway when they had gone? And then there's the other story, what happened to the people where they came to North America. What happened to their lives then? And these stories are often very different stories. In America, they would come and start a new life, and they would build a new communities, and they would build families and cities. And so it's kind of a thing about building something new. This thing that goes on in the new in their new home, whereas back home we kind of celebrated too, but in a different way. It was a possibility for people to leave when times were bad, and that's also an important part of our history. I was actually contacted by the Norwegian embassy regarding this talk because next year it's going to be 200 years since the first official immigration started in 1825. So we'll be preempting that celebration with this talk tonight, and hopefully there'll be more activities as we go into the next year. So let me see. I like to start this talk with an overview of history so that we see how these events fit into the rest of a historical timeline, let's say. And I'm going to start all the way back to the Norwegian immigration to Iceland, which happened around 870. Then there are a couple of events that are important to our talk, and that is the American Revolution, the ideas that came up in that time when the Americans made their constitution. And then following that was the French Revolution. These are very important times, events in history that influenced a lot of things that were going on in Europe, also in Norway, because we get our constitution in 1814, very much reflecting a lot of this sentiment, these new ideas from the American and the French Revolution. The first immigration from Norway starts in 1825 with the ship, the Restoration. We'll talk a bit about that. Another important event was the end of the Navigation Act, the British Act that prevented other nations' ships from trading in the British islands and their colonies. Then the Homestead Act, that was a very important act in the United States that gave land to new settlers. The first wave of Norwegian immigrants really that was significant was around 1866 to 73. Followed by a second wave in 1878 to 90, and then eventually a third wave around 1903 to 1910. We will also talk a bit about Gros Ild, how that influenced the Norwegian emigration, because many Norwegians came there, as opposed to going through New York, for example, where most people went. Also remember that the Canadian Confederation was formed in 1867, in a very, very important time in history too, and also the union with Sweden. Norway and Sweden broke up in 1905. All this is happening as people are leaving Scandinavia, as they're leaving Norway. These very important events are happening around what we're going to talk about. So that's why it's important to remember them, remind ourselves of them. Ellis Island, we'll touch on that too. Ellis Island, the island off New York City, where many people came. And then just remember the last big events in our talk, the Great Depression, which basically put an end to emigration, and people didn't move anymore because of what had happened to the world economy. And of course, the First World War as another event that basically ended very much of migration. Now, I talked about Iceland and the Norwegians. That was really the first wave, way back in the Viking period, settlement of Iceland, which took place in 870. And why did Norwegians leave at that point in time? Well, if you remember your history, it was around the time when Norway was united under one king, King Harald Hårfagre, the fair here. That was maybe 872. We don't know really exactly when it is, but that caused a lot of change, and a lot of chieftains, people who had lost the battle against Harald, didn't have any land, or they were outlawed, so they went to Iceland to create their new home there. And Iceland was unsettled at the time, so there were nobody living in Iceland. It was very cold, kind of a little familiar to Norway, but that was the first migration really that we know about from Norway. Also, during the Viking period, Norwegians settled in the British Isles, you know, not just in Shetland and Orkneys, but also in Scotland. And very many Norwegian Vikings just not raided only, but eventually settled in the British Isles. So that's another big migration as well. And then Normandy. Many of you may not remember that Normandy was settled by Vikings. This was Rollo, the Norwegian Viking Gangerolf, who was asked to set up this settlement to protect the French against other Vikings raiding. So Rollo accepted that, and so Normandy, the land of the Northmen, was established in 911 by Norwegian Vikings. So that's another migration from Norway, a little bit of history here. But let's go back to the time before the first migration that we're going to talk about here, and that's the start of the 1800s. A lot of changes are coming around 1800. And what was happening in Norway at this point in time? Well, it was during the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon had come to power in 1799, and he was making war with almost any country in Europe. So the wars were raging, and this had an effect on Norway that initially was neutral. We were part of Denmark, as you remember. We were quite a poor colony of Denmark. There wasn't that much happening in Norway except for agriculture and fisheries. We were ruled by Danish bureaucracy, or embedsverk, the priest and the judges, all appointed by Copenhagen. And during the Napoleonic War, the Danish, Norway-Denmark, ended up on the side of Napoleon, which you know is the losing side. But before that happened, there was a lot of boycott happening by the British of Norwegian ports. So this caused a lot of starvation. There were not enough food in Norway at this point. So we were kind of very much hurt by these Napoleonic wars. So that was a very big event. We got our constitution in 1814, hoping that we would break away from Denmark and become an independent country. Now that didn't happen because the Treaty of Kiel decided after the Napoleonic time that Sweden was to be taking over Norway. So the union with Sweden was established in 1814, and we had the constitution, but we were not an independent country. So there was a lot of social unrest in the beginning of the 1800s, and this is an important part to remember. There was also a religious awakening. This is something we've heard about, those of you who have had Norwegian history as young kids, the Haugianere. These are the followers of Hans Nielsen Hauge, who was a lay preacher who became quite famous in Norway, and he worked relentlessly from the turn of the century, 1800, up until 1815 or so, and he was converting a lot of people to his way of doing the Lutheran religion. You have to remember, at this point in time, we didn't really have full religious freedom in Norway, because there was something called the conventicle plakaten, or the conventicle act. I don't know if you remember that word from history, but it basically meant that if you were a preacher, had to be endorsed by the church, the Norwegian state church, the Lutheran church, and lay preaching was not allowed. You were not allowed to have meetings. That was forbidden unless the priest had endorsed it and said it was okay. The church wanted control of everything that had to do with religion. So lay preachers like Hans Nielsen Hauge were stopped. They were put in prison. He was himself in prison, I think 14 times, as you see here, and he was a total of 9 years in prison. So this was kind of not religious freedom. But the Haugianer movement was still very, very influential. Actually, 2 people at Eidsvoll were Haugianere, of the Haugian movements. And some of you may remember characters from Norwegian literature. Anybody can remember somebody who was a Haugianer from our literature, from Ibsen or Bjørnstjerne Bjørnson or Kielland? Anybody? Have you heard about Synnøve Solbakken? Yeah, Bjørnstjerne Bjørnson's famous heroine. She was a Haugianer. And also Solveig in Per Gynt by Henrik Ibsen. She was also a Haugianer. And Henriette from Garman and Voss, and Vosse, the novel from Stavanger, Alexander Kielland's novel, she was also a Haugianer. So this was a very strong and big movement in Norway, despite this religious persecution that they had. There were also Quakers in Norway. You might not think that, but at this point there were some Quakers, and the Quakers also were not really supporting the state church. They did things differently. The Quakers didn't believe in having priests. They would be just gathering together, and they would just meet in houses and not say very much, just think about religion and pray. And this was, of course, not allowed, because you had to have endorsement by the priest to do that. So they also felt persecuted. And this guy, Klein Persson, or Klein Pedersen, which was his name, he was one of these Quakers, and he had been traveling to the United States, and he had discovered that things were a lot better there. So he organized this first trip, this first emigration of Norwegians from Stavanger to New York. It was a small ship, a sloop. The name was the Restoration, and only 52 immigrants were on that ship. And a sloop is a very small ship, only one mast. It's a pretty precarious way to travel across the Atlantic, but that's what they did. And they came to America as the first group of immigrants from Norway. Kling Pearson met them there, and they established their communities. One was up by Lake Ontario. That was the first community they established, and also later Kling Pearson moved to Texas, to Illinois, and then to Texas. Kling Pearson is a hero in the United States, not so much in Norway. You know, he left Norway, but he built something in the United States. So he's very much more known there. And there's a lot of memorials to him there. And also the Haugianers were quite important in the United States because they formed their churches and they brought their idea of religion with them into, you know, their communities where they came. So there's a strong movement or of Haugianer in the Lutheran congregations in the United States, stemming from Hans Nielsen Hauge. So here you see some memorials for the first ship, the Restoration. There was a centennial in 1925, and the next one is coming in 2025. And here you see an image of the ship as well. Another thing was political freedom, which was quite limited. We had the Constitution of 1814, but, you know, people couldn't vote unless they owned land. So there was not the same political freedoms as we see today. There was a lot of change in society. People moved from the farms over to work in factories, and the first labor movements started around 1830, 40, and 50. And one man that we know from this time is Marcus Trane, who was really an educator. He was a teacher who went to start schools for working class people and educate them. And he worked at a very special place called Blåfarveverket at Modum. Some of you may have been there. They make this blue, cobalt blue dye there, and it's quite a place to go visit even today. But he organized them and established schools for them, and he was kind of the first labor leader in Norway. He was also imprisoned because they had decided for some reason that they were going for a revolution. I think he didn't agree with that, but anyway, before he was able to stop it, the police had come and arrested all the people. He was also arrested for political activity and was in jail for a while. But then he emigrated to the United States in 1862 for, you know, for political reasons, to seek a better future there, to be able to say what he wanted. So he started newspapers there. The first one was called Norske Amerikanerne, and later changed to Scandinavian. That was in Chicago. You see an image of it here. And he also continued to publish papers later. And remember, in Norway, it wasn't until 1898 that people, you know, the normal people could vote. If you had land, you could vote. But if you didn't have land, if you were just a working class, then you didn't get a vote until 1898. So, you know, there was some reason for political, you know, to move due to political persecution in Norway too at this time. We have a lot of change in Norway with the Industrial Revolution, and that changes everything in society. People start moving around, and you know, the farms become less productive. New industries are starting up in the cities, so people move to the cities, and so on. In Norway, there was generally three main factors in the Industrial Revolution. That was fishing, it was some mining and forestry. And these were the pillars of the Industrial Revolution in Norway. And with the export of fish and forest products and establishment of some factories around mines, the Industrial Revolution in Norway got started. And it led to quite a big change in the GNP. It was a big growth period for Norway over this period up until 1870. Shipping increased tremendously. The tonnage of Norwegian ship owners were tenfold in this period. So there was a lot of change, needing people in the cities to work in the factories and also on the ships to work on the expansion of the shipping. But there were also other factors contributing to migration. There was overpopulation. People didn't die during childhood so much anymore. The families continued to be quite large. There wasn't enough land to provide farms for all these people. The oldest son would inherit the farm. It would not be divided up among the other children. So the other children would not have really any good line of work, except they could be school teachers or priests or some other profession like that. But the overpopulation, especially in the rural areas, caused a lot of change and a lot of migration. And at the same time, there were new opportunities that they saw. Possibilities were opening up in North America. There were also some strange restrictions in Norway at the time. You needed a passport to travel even within the country. So it was quite regulated. This ended in around 1860, and that opened up for a lot more migration. So there was a lot of immigration from Norway as a result of this, but was also very much migration within the country, and even Swedes migrated to Norway in this period. I mentioned the repeal of the British Navigation Act. That was quite important because it meant that Britain was no longer having monopoly on sailing between the United Kingdom and the colonies, for example, Canada. They opened up for free trade so that other countries like Norway could start trading goods between these British colonies and Great Britain. And that gave a big opportunity for Norwegian shipping industry to really expand, but also gave an opportunity for these ships to bring immigrants to the new world. So this act opened up for a lot of migration to come via Canada, via Quebec, and not just via the United States. So that was an important change at the time. And then the Homestead Act. This is a very important act that really is a driver for many of the farmers in particular who leave Norway. And, make a note of the time here, 1862. It's during the American Civil War, 1861 to 65. In this war, the United States lost a lot of people, and also they wanted to expand the population. So they opened up for a free homestead of up to 160 acres of land. You could just imagine a farmer in Norway living on a farm up in the mountains with maybe some goats and a steep hill to farm. And then he was offered for free 160 acres in the United States. What a draw wasn't that to go over and take that opportunity. There had been some other acts before that had given land to immigrants, but they were not totally free. The Preemption Act of 1841 you could get 160 acres of federal land for $125 per acre. Still quite a low price, but not for nothing. And the Oregon Land Donation Act of 1850 had also been of big interest for farmers who wanted to go over. But the Homestead Act of 1862 gave land for free west of the Mississippi. So these lands were typically, Wisconsin, well, Minnesota, Dakotas, Iowa. These these states were now opening up for migrants. And, immigrants were allowed. It wasn't just for Americans. They wanted to have people coming over from Europe and build farms there and also to increase the population in the United States at this point in time. So as a result of all these things happening in Norway, there are waves of emigration, and they are basically in three big waves from 1866 to 73. This is right after the Homestead Act, as you can see. The war in the United States is over in 1865. So there's peace in the United States and you can get free land. So that's a really big draw for migrants to leave Norway. And then there is another big wave around 1870, late 1870s to 1890s, and then finally a third wave in 1903 to 1910. A smaller wave a little bit later, but these are the three big waves where lots of people left. Now, the first wave was mostly farmers from the farms in the mountains, in the rural areas in Norway. They could now get free land. And these farmers, they saw things changing with the Industrial Revolution. And they wanted to stay farmers. They didn't want to be working in a factory. They didn't want to move to the cities. They felt that this was their trade, to be a farmer. They had small farms and it was hard work, but they were willing to do hard work. And when they saw this opportunity for 160 acres for free in the United States, of course, it was a tremendous draw for them. So in this wave, it was farmers and farming families that went together as big, groups. And at this time, there were still sailing ships, and they would take about 2 months to get across. So this was quite a terrible journey. The steamships came much later and would reduce the crossing to about a week or 10 days, maybe 2 weeks, but much less. It was much more comfortable with steamships to go over to the New World. Oops, sorry. And here you see a map of Norway showing you, I hope you can see the details there, showing you in the color code here where people left from. And you see the darkest red color is where most people left. Over 40% of the population in these communities left. Maybe 50%, maybe half of everybody in these communities would leave for North America. That's a lot of people to leave. And you see where these communities are. It's the mountain communities on the east part of Norway, also on the west coast and down to the southern part of Norway, but mostly the mountain communities. And any area that has any kind of red color, it's over 20% or over 30% or over 40% of people leaving. So this is a tremendous amount of population going. And then you have a second wave around 1870 to early 1890. And the reasons for this wave was that there was a shipping crisis around 1870. A lot of people were employed in shipping, and the shipping industry was very important to Norway. So when there was a crisis in this industry, then that was a big push for people to leave. And the largest number of people left in this period from late 1870 to early 1890, about 250,000 people left in this period. So that's quite a lot of people. And then there was a third wave from 1803 to 1810. The immigration is changing. It's more skilled people who are leaving, people who have a profession, who are carpenters or who have special skills, and often very much individuals, not families so much anymore. It's much more individuals who are going to bigger cities where to find work. There's a lot of work in the United States and Canada, so they go to the bigger cities to find work. So that's the third wave. A lot of the drive came also from the letters that came from the people who had come to North America. They wrote letters home, telling their families and neighbors about what it was like to live in the new world, what was farming like. And this gave, of course, a large amount of information to those who were still in Norway, and it made them more interested. First of all, because they saw that their family members had been successful in North America. They had managed to establish farms, and now they wanted the rest of their families to come over. So they wrote letters about all the things that they had experienced. You know, they would say things like, yes, people are very friendly here. There's a lot of hard work. But if you're willing to work hard, then there is, profit from that, and you can grow your farm and you can have a good life here. And they, continued to communicate with their families over the years. And these letters from America are not just interesting from the point of view of what life was like in the New World, but also, as historical documents to understand how the new settlers lived in North America. And I said steamships were used now, so there was much shorter crossing. There was a lot of reunions of family members. Many older parents had now emigrated because their kids had already gone to the United States, and now they would follow them because there was nobody at home to take care of them anymore. So then they go and live with their kids in order to have a secure pension or senior life. And also many women came over to marry settlers there. And so it was quite an interesting kind of emigration that took place in this. Good. So let me move over to talk a little bit about where they landed. United States, most people landed at Ellis Island. From 1890, Ellis Island was the processing center for all immigrants, most immigrants to the United States. Before 1890, they were processed in New York, on Manhattan, at the end of Manhattan, at Battery Park, at Fort Clinton. But from 1890, it was a federal thing to accept immigrants into the United States. So they organized everything at Ellis Island. And a total of 12 million immigrants were processed here. So this is, it's quite a place. And very many immigrants to the United States have come through Ellis Island. And there's a big database of all the registries of immigrants who came from every country, also from Norway, which ship they came on, which day they came, their names, their family members, that you can go to the Ellis Island website and you can look up your ancestors there. That's quite interesting to do. And this database has a total of 65 million names in it. So try that if you're interested. There was another processing center in Canada, and that was Grosse Ile, in the St. Lawrence River right before Quebec City. This is very famous for the Irish migrants, immigrants who came there in around 1847 to 50, and they were all very much, you know, diseased by the potato famine. So this was quite a devastating place. They had to be quarantined there for 40 days to make sure that they were healthy enough to enter Canada. So at Grosse Île, they established this quarantine center, which consists of all kinds of housing that reflected the various kind of cabins you would have on the ship. There would be a first-class cabin, and they would go in first-class housing on shore, and the second class, and so on. And all the services on land were kind of mirroring whatever was happening on the ship. There was hospitals there, and you see from the numbers here that mostly there were immigrants from Britain or from Ireland in this period. There were an increasing number of Scandinavians that came as well. And most of those, many of those were Norwegian, coming on Norwegian ships who could now sail to Quebec with passengers from around 1850. So we see that quite a number of immigrants come through Grosse Île. It's a museum now, you can go and visit it. There is this memorial plaque you see there. There's 7,500 or so graves at the cemetery there, and all the names on the graves are engraved in these glass plaques on the island. And of course, it's mostly Irish names. People died on their way to the new land. But you also see that there are Norwegian names here. You can see that, you know, Samson Andersen, Ole Arnesen, Astrid Aslaksdottir, Jon Gjermundsen, and so on. So there's probably about 300-400 Norwegian graves there. And these were Norwegian immigrants who died on their way to North America, either on the ship or when they had arrived at Grosse Île. But this was a very important processing center for Scandinavians because they also had an interpreter for the Norwegian on Grosse Île. They had an interpreter for German, and they had an interpreter for Norwegian, in addition, of course, to English, which people spoke at the time. So Grosse Île was very important also for Norwegians who came to North America. So what was it like? How did they live in the new land? This is an important part of the story. The interesting thing is that they tried to stay as Norwegian as they could. They kept their language. They moved together in communities where they could be, you know, create schools or churches. So these communities were typically all of Norwegian settlers, speaking Norwegian language and having all events and activities in Norwegian, the schools and so on. That was the typical way that the settlers came. We can still see today many of these communities in you know, the Midwest have a very, very strong Norwegian heritage. Any kind of heritage, really. Some are German, some are Finnish, some are Swedish, but we see also the Norwegian heritage there very, very strong. And they would support each other. They would build their religious communities. That was very important. As I mentioned, the Haugiana movement was very strong in the Lutheran church that the Norwegians established in North America. So this life over there was still very much like being in Norway. So they would write home about their life and, you know, tell their families and friends that they could come over and live in this community. And so there was the barrier for the new immigrants was quite low. The language wasn't a problem. They would find their own church there. They would find family members there. So you can just see how that would draw more people into these communities. And also, some of these farms were quite large. If you get 160 acres, it's cheap. It's for nothing. But you need people to run these farms. So they needed their families to come over and help them to run the farms, because that was the only way that they could, get good production out of such a large amount of land. So that was often they would pay for their transportation over and says, we'll pay for you coming here. You just work for us for a couple of years and then you can start on your own. That's how they did it often. And by this time, the emigration was really something that was put in a system. I mean, you could go to a local agent in your community, maybe the lensman or the local grocer, and you could buy your ticket to go to North America. It was so easy, and then it was a package tour, right? So this was at later stage, this was very, very organized. So once you decided, I'm going to go, you just go down to the local grocer and say, can I have one ticket to the United States, please? And, it's, of course, it might not have been that simple, but still it was a little bit like that, booking your trip over. And then you knew where you were going because you had lots of letters from your family. So you felt really safe about the whole thing. And with the steamships, it only took a week and so on. So this was quite great. And talk a little bit about immigration to Canada. Land eventually ran out towards the end of the 1800s in the Dakotas and in Minnesota. And now Canada was opening up. And Canada didn't have that much immigration at this point, and they needed people to settle in the prairie provinces. So the government now started giving out land grants in Canada too. And what happened was that a lot of US farmers, I mean settlers who had already settled in the Midwest in the US, now realized that they could get bigger farms and cheaper farms by moving north across the border to Saskatchewan or Alberta. So they would sell their farms in the Midwest, in the Dakotas, for quite a lot of money. Land was getting more expensive there, and they would get these very cheap farms across the border to Canada. And the other thing was that the wheat prices, wheat was the main thing that they grew at this point in time, were going up very high. So this was a cash crop that they could really very quickly make money on. So that cost a lot of drive from the Midwest north Canada. But in Canada, you get your farm, homestead, but you had to stay for 3 years before you got the deed. So for many, this was a problem, that they realized that it wasn't that sustainable as they had thought. So anyway, this was a big drive to settle in Canada. And from 1901 about is when Norwegians emigrate directly from Norway to the prairie provinces in Canada. So here is a little bit of a population map of the Northwest in the Midwest, in the United States. And you see here up, oops, that doesn't work. Anyway, the dark brown one there, that's greater than, there you go, greater than 23% Norwegian heritage in the North Dakota. That's North Dakota. And then next to that is Minnesota. That's 10 to 12% Norwegian heritage in that whole state. And this is from 2020. So there's a lot of people there who are either directly emigrated from Norway or who claim that they have Norwegian heritage. So that's a total, if you add that up, a total of over 4 million people in the United States claim that they have Norwegian heritage. So that's where most of them ended up. As you see, of course, these are the big centers of Norwegian settlement. And here you see a bar graph of how many came and which years they came. And you see that total here on this graph, this is United States, it's about 750,000. They say that the total might have been 900,000 of Norwegians who came over from 1825. And most of them came, as you can see on the map, from 1880 to 89, and then from 90 to, or from 1900 to 1909. These are the biggest bars on the graph. So these are huge. And the Norwegian immigration was the largest per capita, but apart from the Irish immigration. So why did it end, or how did it end? Well, first of all, the US started to introduce restrictions on immigration. They started to introduce quotas for certain countries from around 1917. So around the First World War, that's when they started to limit the number. But the alternative at that time was to go to Canada, because there was no limitation in Canada. So that's how Canada became very important. Then in 1829, we had the financial crisis, which of course is an economic event that basically made it very difficult to have work in the United States or Canada or anywhere in the world, actually. So that basically set a stop for most of immigration from Norway. And the interesting thing is, of a lot of those who left, 25% went back. 25%. So if 900,000 left and stayed, you know, you can just imagine there must have been a lot of them also going back. And this was for several reasons. It wasn't because that they weren't happy or successful there. Often they went back because they had made money, and now they could go back and live in Norway and have a much better life, for example. Or they wanted to live out their older days in Norway. Felt that this was something that they wanted to do rather than to live in the new world. So there were many reasons for going back, and so it wasn't just because they were unhappy, but it is a fact that about 25% of them actually did come back. Good. I'm 6 minutes over time here, but we should open up for a little bit of a Q&A or commentary from you guys if you're interested.